Hello lovely people, welcome to part 2 of my May reading wrap up.
Doobie 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 doo. Doobie 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 Sophie vlogs.
I read a gazillion books in May, it feels like. I did 2 Medieval Mystic May reading vlogs, which should have gone up by now, and then in the first half of my May wrap up I talked about the books I read for the Asian Readathon and the books you recommended to me. In this final bit, I'm just scooping up everything else that is left. Because I devoured little books like a greedy little worm. This is all non-fiction, so I'm just going to dive into all of it. First up is Republic, Britain's Revolutionary Decade, 1649 to 1660 by Alice Hunt. This is a non-fiction that is all about when Britain was a republic. It begins with, the execution of Charles I, the abolition of the monarchy, the establishment of the republic, and then it goes through up until the Restoration. And what I enjoyed about this is that it is this chronological telling. Like, I'm fairly basically familiar with the period of the Republic. I enjoyed the introduction actually, where she talks about how it's always referred to as like the interregnum, almost in like a way to like tamp down on how revolutionary it was that we were actually a republic and we abolished the monarchy. Like it's talked about now that we're once again a monarchy, like this aberration time. So I have familiarity with that era fairly all right, but I did enjoy having it laid out in this. Every section is a year, really does help you see, I guess, like the stretch of things, how you can understand the broader strokes, but getting it on a slightly more like minutia level of like what each year unfolded like. That was really helpful. And then like, obviously just things are expanded upon in much greater detail because you do have this chronological breakdown. So this is one where I feel like it didn't blow my mind, but I did enjoy reading it. And I do think if you have an interest in this time period and you're not really very familiar with it, I do think she does a really good job of really like laying all that out for you. And I think something that I kind of appreciated was that within each section that is based around a year, she manages to avoid like harkening forward too much, like there's a slight level of having to be like in the next year, blah blah, but like it was very contained, so you don't feel like you're flip flopping around. Sometimes when you read, like in my part 1, I talked about Big Sister, Little Sister, Red Sister by Chang. And something that I said about that is that because she follows individuals, she'll often take you up to a certain point in time, and then when she's picking up the thread of another individual, she has to go like much further back in time and like bring you back up to speed on like what this person was doing. And this doesn't have that because you are just taking it year by year, so it feels nice and contained each time. So it's very easy to like follow the thread of what happened and to then expand on smaller details into larger focus and that kind of thing. So I do think it was like an enjoyable, engaging non-fiction. Speaking of Young Chang, I actually listened to 2 of her books this month entirely by fluke. So I took out that other one that I mentioned in part 1 on a whim because I ran out of library holds, and then a hold came through much sooner than anticipated, which was Fly Wild Swans by Young Chang. This is the sequel to her wonderful book Wild Swans. Wild Swans is a history of China through the women in her family. So her grandmother, who was the concubine to a warlord, her mother, who was a member of the Communist Party, and then herself. And it's a wonderful, lovely, chunky non-fiction memoir that I would absolutely recommend. This is her much more recently released sequel to that, so it is focusing on her and her mother. And it does at the beginning tread some of the same ground as Wild Swans. I didn't think I remembered Wild Swans that well until I started listening to this book, and I was like, oh wait, I actually know a lot of this stuff right at the beginning. I think it's helpful if you haven't read Wild Swans to give you context. And then the majority of this then focuses on her own life, leaving China as a student to come to the UK, writing Wild Swans, writing her other books, like her Mal book, which was very controversial. And then there's like a really heavy through line throughout of this like relationship with her mother. I now understand that towards the end of the book, she talks about when her mother became ill and passed away. And so I can see how this book is very much written like she clearly loves her mother very, very much. I think sometimes like a small critique of it as a book might be that she loves her mother so much that like there's often not there's not like a lot of distance from her mother. Like I understand the love that she has for her as her mum. I think it would be really interesting to know a bit more about this woman who was very involved in the Communist Party, but then Chang, who had after certain points, particularly with her publication of her Mao book, like had a lot of difficulty with the Chinese authorities and that kind of thing. Like, I don't know. I feel like there's maybe an element of your mother outside of the loving support that she gave you that would have been interesting to like explore. I don't know. I don't feel like this is as strong as Wild Swans, but it's quite a high bar to like match up to, so I enjoyed listening to it. There were elements that I found very interesting. Again, this was another one which it was like I enjoyed listening to it. I do appreciate some of the extra stuff that I have, but I don't think it's as like dazzling a wonderful read as that original book is. A physical non-fiction from the library is Love in Exile by Shon Faye. I was interested in reading this because I loved the transgender issue by Shon Faye. I think it's a really fantastic piece of non-fiction that is really examining what life is like for transgender people now. A lot of the rhetoric that gets used against them, it really like breaks that down and like rebuttals it and that kind of thing. When I read that book, I felt it was like incredibly well researched, like very well put together, and I recommend it to a lot of people. This is a more of a personal essay collection that is themed around love. Each chapter has like a different focus, and throughout it you're exploring I guess initially the initial chapters are much more concerned with like romantic relationships. She talks a lot about her experiences dating, the idea of love that she had, and love as this something that is incredibly important, will fix you, the way that meeting someone and falling in love should feel, and then what that did to her and her relationships. And that has elements to do with like the messaging you're given as a transgender woman and the things that you internalize, and having to like how that then manifests when you try and have these relationships, how men treat you in relationships, and how like that whole thing. But as it goes through, it does expand to other forms of love. There's a chapter all about like how friendship is really like the most abiding relationships of her life. There's a chapter about like motherhood and the fact that she doesn't want to be a mother and how she feels about that. And there's one at the very end, because she was raised Catholic, that is about like religious love and her relationship with that. So I think the like variety is interesting. I think for me, this doesn't have as much cohesion to it as maybe I like in a collection. And as I was like, when I finished this book, I was thinking about it, and I was like, I think that a personal taste thing for me is that I really like essay collections that have a strong like through point argument, or if they don't have a strong 3-point argument, that is clear in the introduction. Because as I finished this, I was thinking about it. I was like, for me, some of these chapters feel just distinctly less impactful than others, less tight, less I don't know, not all of them really like hit as hard as some of them did. And I was thinking about other essay collections that I've read this year, and I was like, I feel like I've said this about, like, I think I said this about All Consuming by Ruby Tando, which is another author that I love. And I was like, oh, like, I thought there would be much more like this subheading. I thought it would be tying throughout more. So that's something that I am observing about myself as a reader, is that maybe I need to factor that in when I'm picking up essay collections. I don't know. That I read for my Read the World project for Ecuador was We Will Be Jaguars by Nemonte, Nenquimo, and Mitch Anderson. Nemonte is a indigenous Ecuadorian activist. A memoir, you follow her from childhood as she grows up in the rainforests in Ecuador, and she's initially part of this community that is very defined by, they have this white missionary woman who lives with them, who has sort of set up this community, and sets a lot of the rules for how people, how it all functions and everything. And then this woman passes away, and then that has like an effect on the community changing and all this kind of thing. And as a young woman, she becomes very engaged in Christianity. What happens as the book goes on is that you see her growing awareness of the ways in which her people and her land are being exploited. She has some quite horrible experiences when she goes off with missionaries, and how she's treated. So I would give like some trigger warning to like sexual assault, rape, and that kind of thing. And equally, there's a lot of focus on the ways in which this land is exploited, and the knock-on effect of also how the people who are indigenous to there are exploited. And I thought it was a really powerful read. I think she is now an activist, and she's one of the activists who helped secure this like historic land protection rights and everything, which was like really interesting to read about. And I have a lot of admiration for the activism work that she's done. I think as a book, it manages to be very accessibly written. It's one of those, I've already recommended this to someone that I know is like very passionate about like climate justice and that kind of thing, because I think that she'll really enjoy it. So it's definitely one that I'm like really glad to have read the perspective of. It's like linking to like ideas of environmental rights and all that kind of thing. I also listened to Birdgirl by Mya-Rose Craig. She holds the record for being the youngest person to see half the world's bird species, I believe. She wrote this very young. She wrote this, was she 18? Maybe, was she 21? Can't remember. Very young. And it's her memoir about her family. She grew up, I didn't realise she's from Bristol. I think she probably, if she grew up, she lived near Tree Valley Lake, and I think that means that she probably went to the same school as one of my friends. Not at the same time, I don't think. So she grew up in a family that is very passionate about bird watching. It is a birding memoir, and there is a lot about travelling the world and the birds that she's seen, and all of that kind of thing. It's also, because it is a personal memoir as well, there's a whole thread of this that looks at her mum had a lot of struggle with mental health, and that had a real impact on the family, and part of the reason why they took her out of school and travelled so extensively was that travelling the world and doing all this bird watching was really good for her mum's mental health, and like helped some of the struggles they were having like lessen and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of focus on that as well. And there's a thread that is also like her activism. So she's clearly very passionate about the environment. She also does a lot of work about making nature accessible to ethnic minority backgrounds. So her mum's family is Bangladeshi, and she talks a lot about what it's like being in these very white spaces as like usually her and her mum like the only two people who are not white, and what that experience is, and then the work she's done to try and like increase like children who grow up in urban environments getting into nature and all that kind of thing. So I think that there's a lot of really great like activism work she does and all that kind of thing. How I feel about this as like an actual book to read is that I do think that I could feel her youth. I like a reflective book. That's on Storygraph one of my big words apparently. I think that this is told, it's told in a linear way. It's told just like you go through her life as it happened. I just think that when it comes to the actual like writing style and the reflection aspect, like it's not hitting for me in that side of things. So like the things she is saying like a lot of the time I agree with, but it's just like they're not told in a way that I find particularly exciting. And maybe this is how I feel about all of this, is I want a little bit more like reflection, because I kind of felt a little bit the same with some of the engagements with like climate change and stuff. Is she does talk a little bit about like ecotourism at times, but I don't know, I guess like she goes to Antarctica, and I feel like Antarctic tourism is quite a hot topic in the like conservation, like ethical tourism world, and that didn't really get engaged with. I guess there's like a attention to me reading this as like the family are clearly well off enough that they can afford to go and travel the world and do all of these things, and I don't begrudge people that. There's a little bit of lip service given to like it's important to these communities in these areas to have ecotourism because it means that they can rely on doing things in a more eco-friendly, they can do all the tourist stuff in a more ethical, eco-friendly way because they know that there are like green tourists coming. But I don't think it like really meaningfully engaged with like, I guess reading it, I was like, what's the ethics of being someone who's such a passionate bird watcher that you want to travel the whole world to find birds versus the impact that we know comes from flying everywhere, travel, like use the car that you're driving to get to all these places, like all of that. Like I guess to me, I feel like surely there must be quite a conflict in a person. I guess to me, I'm like, is there a conflict there within you of like thinking about how those things go together? And I don't know, maybe I'm wanting something from the book that doesn't exist, but those are the areas in which I feel if maybe this had been written in like a couple of years when you're slightly more mature, maybe would have been maybe a bit more present. I do, as just like a listening experience, like I enjoyed learning about birds. There's some really great birds in the world. And like I enjoyed that whole aspect, so I didn't dislike the book. It's just these are the sorts of thoughts that I've had since finishing it. The book to talk about is Ireland in Iceland, Gaelic Remnants in a Nordic Land by Manchan Magan. Manchan Magan I have read before because I read his book 32 Words for Field. I hope I've got the number correct. I always forget. 32 Words for Field is a really interesting exploration of the Irish language and like historically, linguistically, all of this kind of things. I really enjoyed it when I read it. I was really sad when he passed away last year. This was released either just before he passed or just after he passed. And it's a exploration of the Irish links with Iceland. So we know that Irish settlers went to Iceland, and what he's examining initially is a lot of the linguistic links between Irish, Icelandic, like word remnants that we have, that kind of thing. And he also goes into like the sagas, like the Lanamabok, I cannot say that word, Lanamabok. Sorry. These where you can see in Icelandic sagas and Irish writings like where like historical moments where actual overlap happened and how they've been presented in either culture's literature. Like that was really interesting. And then like it's very much like a lighter non-fic because all of this is interspersed with lots of illustrations throughout and that kind of stuff. I perfectly enjoyed this. It was a lovely little read. It is a lighter one, so I don't feel like I have as much to say as I did about like 32 Words for Field. I guess the one thing I would say is that he is much fonder of these things are so similar that surely can't be a coincidence than I think I am, because my brain goes, correlation is not causation. So when it's like linguistics and sagas and all of that, like I'm really with it. And then it gets a little bit more loosey-goosey later with like, both cultures really revere the fair folk, so surely that's something that the Irish brought to Iceland. And I was like, there's loads of cultures around the world that like revere their mythology, baby. So there's a few bits when it gets slightly later where I enjoyed it, but maybe slightly less like buying in. But that's just me. He was an absolute expert, and I really enjoyed reading this. He has another book that I haven't read that is words to do with weather. I would like to read at some point because that also seems very interesting. One of those little books where you have lots of little tidbits that's interesting to remember. The final book I have to talk about is actually a book that I finished in April that I forgot to talk about in my April reading wrap-up. And that is Up the Youth Club, Illuminating a Hidden History by Emma Warren. A history of the youth club in the UK. And I love a niche little history book that explores like a topic that I've not really thought about before. Mostly, this just made me sad because it goes through like the development of youth clubs when they sort of first became a thing, like Baden Powell and all that kind of stuff, and then like through, you know, they've changed over the decades. And she talks a lot to people who attended youth clubs, were actively involved in running youth clubs, like really looks at like the societal benefit of these spaces, and also how the spaces responded to changing times. And why it made me sad was just because we've lost so much funding that a lot of youth clubs don't exist anymore. And I think that is a shame, because I think what one thing that came across very clearly from this is that there is such immense value to young people for having spaces that are carved out for socializing, and socializing in very like in ways in which they're not being monitored, but there are adults there for guidance. And you know, like, there's a level of having spaces where you can hang out with your friends. It does feel like in modern society those disappear more, because, you know, if kids spend time outside, some like they're accused of loitering and these things. If they spend too much time talking to their friends on screens, then like that's also bad. You know, like the youth club as a space where you can see your friends, great. The youth club is a space where you can also build meaningful relationships with adults that are like age appropriate, and also like people who can give you guidance, and like areas where you're not being monitored in your sociability, but there is help if you need it, and there is some form of like oversight, intergenerational interactions, like all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, interesting to see how this area changed based on who's funding it, what the situation the rest of the country is like, all of that stuff, and sad to think of what we have sort of lost. So yeah. So yes, that's everything I read in May. The only other book I wanted to briefly mention is, I said in my Medieval Mystic Maid TBR that I might read The Name of the Rose. I have started reading it, but it's carrying over into June because I have not finished reading it, but I'm enjoying it so far. So Umberto Eco will come hopefully next month. But I did just want to say, because I feel like I've mentioned this in a couple of TBRs, and I just wanted to have it on record that I have actually started it. I just haven't finished it. So yes, I hope that this was in any way interesting. Please do leave me a comment should any of these appeal to you. Otherwise, I hope you're having the loveliest of days, and I will see you next time for something different.